Sometimes the deepest pain comes from losing the one person who made life worth living. When grief becomes so heavy that a man disappears into the mountains, leaving behind everything he once knew, folks tend to forget he's still human underneath all that hurt. For 20 years, Silas McCrae lived alone on Timber Ridge, haunted by memories of the wife he couldn't save from that terrible fire. The people of Granger Hollow spoke his name in whispers, warning their children to stay clear of the wild man's cabin. Then one brutal winter night, a dying dog stumbled through the storm and collapsed at his door. What happened next changed everything. But what was it about this wounded animal that finally broke through 20 years of isolation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pines like a banshee's wail, rattling the shutters of the small cabin that clung to Timber Ridge like a barnacle on a ship's hull. Inside, Silas McCrae sat motionless beside his wood-burning stove, watching the golden retriever's labored breathing in the flickering firelight. The dog lay on Martha's old quilt, the one with the blue cornflower pattern she'd stitched during their first winter together. 23 years had passed since she'd worked those careful stitches by lamplight, humming church hymns while snow gathered against their windows in town. Silas reached beneath the loose floorboard near his chair, fingers finding the small wooden box he'd carved from mountain cedar. Inside, Martha's wedding ring rested on a bed of faded cotton, the simple gold band still holding the warmth of promises made, and a love that death couldn't diminish. He held it up to the firelight, remembering how it had caught the sun that morning. She'd slipped it on her finger, her eyes bright with joy and mischief. "I do, Silas McCrae," she'd whispered in the little church in Granger Hollow. For better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part, death had parted them all right. But not the way they'd imagined during those golden years when Silas built furniture with his hands and Martha tended her garden. When Sunday dinners meant a table full of neighbors and laughter that echoed off the walls of their little house on Elm Street. The fire had started in the kitchen, a pot holder too close to the stove. Martha always said she was careless with such things. By the time Silas smelled the smoke and burst through the front door, the back half of the house was already engulfed. He'd fought through the flames, calling her name, his lungs searing with each breath. Found her unconscious near the bedroom door, her nightgown singed, her beautiful auburn hair. Silas closed his eyes, forcing the memory back into its dark corner. The search and rescue team had arrived just as he carried her out, their dogs barking and men shouting orders in the chaos of that terrible night. Doc Henley worked on her for what seemed like hours, while Silas paced the snow-covered yard, praying to a God who seemed to have turned his back on Granger Hollow. She'd lived for 3 more days, long enough to tell him it wasn't his fault, long enough to make him promise he'd keep living. A promise he'd kept, technically, though living had become something different after they lowered her pine casket into the frozen ground. The dog stirred, whimpering softly, and Silas returned the ring to its hiding place. The animal was in bad shape, deep gashes along his flanks, one ear torn, and a limp that suggested damaged ribs or worse. But his eyes held intelligence, and when Silas had first lifted him from the doorstep, those brown eyes had looked at him with something that might have been recognition. Granger Hollow had grown in the 20 years since Silas disappeared into the mountains. What started as a farming community of maybe 200 souls had swelled to nearly 800, thanks to the lumber mill and the railroad spur that brought city folks looking for mountain property. Doc Henley still tended the sick, though his hair had gone white and his hands showed the tremor of advancing years. Sheriff Coleman had replaced his father in the job, a steady man who kept the peace and minded his own business. Mrs. Whitman still ran the general store, though her daughter Sarah helped now, and the young woman had inherited her mother's sharp tongue and generous heart. They all remembered Silas McCrae, the quiet carpenter who'd built half the houses in town before tragedy broke him. In the early years after Martha's death, folks would find fresh-cut firewood stacked beside their doors after difficult times, or discover their broken fences mysteriously repaired. Doc Henley never could account for missing medical supplies, and Sheriff Coleman's father used to joke that angels worked the night shift in Granger Hollow. But as the years passed and Silas never showed his face, the helpful presence faded into legend. New families moved in who knew nothing of the grieving widower who'd fled to the mountains. To them, Silas McCrae became the boogeyman parents used to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. "You stay clear of Timber Ridge," mothers would warn. "That's where the wild man lives. Hasn't been civilized in decades. Some say he's forgotten how to talk. Others claim he's gone completely mad with grief." The truth was simpler and more complicated. Silas had built his cabin in a clearing where he and Martha used to picnic during their courtship. She'd loved the view of the valley below, the way morning mist gathered in the hollows like cotton batting. "If we ever want to disappear from the world," she'd said once, "this is where we go." So he'd gone. Built the cabin with his own hands, using techniques Martha had watched him perfect over their years together. Stocked it with supplies that would last through any winter, created a life of routine and solitude that kept the worst of his grief at bay, while honoring the love that still defined him. Every morning, he rose before dawn and read aloud from the Bible Martha had given him on their wedding day. Every evening, he carved small figures from pine and cedar, mostly animals, sometimes people who looked suspiciously like Martha. He kept a garden, using seeds he'd saved from Martha's flowers, and when they bloomed each spring, he'd sit among them and tell her about his day. The townspeople had it wrong about one thing: Silas hadn't forgotten how to talk. He spoke to Martha every day, carrying on conversations that felt as real as any he'd shared when she was alive. He told her about the weather, about the deer that visited his garden, about the letters that occasionally found their way to his old address in town. Mrs. Whitman would leave them in a coffee can nailed to a tree at the base of the mountain trail, and Silas would collect them on his rare supply runs. Most were advertisements or government notices, but sometimes there were wedding invitations from young couples he'd known as children, or birth announcements that made him wonder what Martha would have said about this or that baby's name. She'd always been good with children, patient in a way that made them trust her immediately. The dog's breathing had steadied, and his eyes were open now, watching Silas with an alertness that was encouraging. Somewhere in those brown depths was pain, but also a determination that reminded Silas of Martha during her final days. Hurt, but not defeated. Aware that life was precious even when it came with suffering. "Well, boy," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse but still carrying the gentle tone Martha had always loved. "Looks like you and I are going to be spending some time together." The dog's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement that he'd heard and understood. It was the first response Silas had received from another living creature in more years than he cared to count. Something tight in his chest loosened just a fraction, like a knot that had been slowly untying itself without his notice. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Timber Ridge, but inside the cabin, man and dog shared the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of two souls who had somehow found each other in the midst of a winter that seemed determined to bury the world in snow and silence. Silas settled back in his chair, Martha's ring safely hidden beneath the floorboards, and began to plan how he might save a life for the first time in 20 years. Dawn broke grey and cold over Timber Ridge, the storm having finally exhausted itself sometime before sunrise. Silas woke to find the dog watching him from Martha's quilt, those intelligent brown eyes tracking his movement as he rose from his chair. The animal had made it through the night, which was more than Silas had dared hope when he'd first dragged the half-frozen creature inside. "Morning, boy," Silas said softly, moving slowly so as not to startle his unexpected guest. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, weak but unmistakably a greeting. Silas knelt beside the quilt, careful to keep his movements gentle and predictable. In the daylight, he could see the full extent of the animal's injuries. 3 deep gashes ran along the dog's left flank, the edges clean but serious. One ear was torn nearly in half, and dried blood matted the golden fur around his muzzle. But it was the dog's eyes that held Silas's attention, clear, aware, and somehow familiar. From the old leather satchel beneath his kitchen counter, Silas retrieved supplies he'd gathered over the years for treating injured wildlife. The veterinary medical kit had been pieced together during his rare trips to neighboring towns, where he could purchase antiseptic, bandages, and basic medications without drawing attention. Martha had always said he had a gift for healing. Animals trusted him in a way that sometimes surprised even her. "This is going to hurt some," Silas warned, dampening a cloth with antiseptic. "But we need to clean these wounds proper." The dog remained still as Silas worked, only flinching when the antiseptic bit into the deeper cuts. It was the behavior of an animal accustomed to human care, one that understood the difference between help and harm. As Silas cleaned each wound, memories surfaced of other injured creatures he and Martha had tended together. There had been the barn owl with the broken wing, which Martha had nursed back to health in a makeshift pen behind their house in town. The 3-legged coyote pup they'd found, abandoned near Miller's Creek, bottle-fed until it was strong enough to survive on its own. Martha had possessed an endless patience for hurt things, a gentleness that seemed to communicate itself directly to frightened animals. "She would have liked you," Silas murmured as he applied clean bandages to the worst of the gashes. "Had a way with strays, my Martha did. Always said they found us for a reason." The dog's ears pricked at the sound of Martha's name, and for a moment Silas felt the familiar stab of loss that talking about her brought. But this time it was softer somehow, tempered by the presence of this wounded creature who seemed to understand that words carried weight, even when spoken to the empty air. As Silas worked, he found himself talking more than he had in years. The dog listened with the kind of attention Martha used to give his stories about customers at the carpentry shop. Head tilted slightly, eyes never leaving his face. "Funny thing," Silas said, securing the last bandage. "I haven't spoken this much since she passed. Talking to myself is one thing, but talking to another living soul, that's different." The dog struggled to sit up, favoring his injured side but managing to hold the position. His tail wagged again, stronger this time, and he leaned forward to sniff Silas's hand. The touch of his cold nose against Silas's weathered skin was the first physical contact with another living, being that Silas had experienced in 2 decades. Something cracked open in Silas's chest, not breaking but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. He found his hand moving of its own accord to stroke the dog's head, fingers threading through the thick, golden fur. "You're a good boy," he said, and was surprised to hear his voice catch slightly. "Real good boy." By afternoon, the dog was able to stand and take a few tentative steps, though he clearly needed more time to heal. Silas fashioned a bed near the stove using old blankets and positioned food and water within easy reach. The dog ate carefully but with obvious hunger, confirming Silas's suspicion that he'd been wandering for some time before the storm drove him to seek shelter. It was then that Silas noticed something that made him pause. When the dog drank from the water bowl, he did so with a careful, measured approach, lapping exactly 3 times. Then raising his head to check his surroundings before drinking again. It was the behavior of a trained animal, one that had been taught to remain alert even while tending to basic needs. "Where did you come from, boy?" Silas asked, settling into his chair to study his guest more carefully. "And what were you doing out in that storm?" The dog finished drinking and returned to his makeshift bed, but instead of lying down, he sat at attention facing the door. His ears were pricked forward, and every few minutes he would glance at Silas, as if waiting for a command or signal. As evening approached, Silas prepared a simple supper of venison stew and cornbread, sharing portions with the dog, who accepted the offering with dignified gratitude. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, and through the cabin's single window, Silas could see stars emerging in a sky swept clean by the storm. It was then that he heard it, voices carrying on the crisp mountain air, faint and distant but unmistakably human. A search party, most likely, though what they might be searching for in this remote area was beyond his understanding. The dog heard them too, his head snapping toward the window, a low whine building in his throat. But it wasn't the sound of an animal afraid of strangers. It was something else, almost eager, as if those distant voices meant something significant. Silas moved to the window and peered into the darkness. Far below, perhaps a mile down the mountain, he could see the bobbing lights of flashlights or lanterns. Too many to be casual hikers, and moving with the systematic pattern of people conducting an organized search. "Someone's missing," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. But the animal responded anyway, rising carefully to his feet and moving to stand beside Silas at the window. For the first time in 20 years, Silas felt the pull of human concern for strangers in trouble. The old instinct to help, to use his knowledge of these mountains to aid in whatever search was being conducted below, stirred in his chest like an ember that had been banked but never quite extinguished. The dog whined again, and this time Silas was certain he heard recognition in the sound. Whatever that search party was looking for, this wounded animal knew something about it. The pieces didn't quite fit together yet, but Silas could sense the shape of something larger than a simple case of an injured stray finding shelter from a storm. He looked down at the dog, who was looking back at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets and sorrows of their own. "What is it you're not telling me, boy?" Silas asked softly. The dog's tail wagged once, and in that simple gesture, Silas felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in 2 decades. Curiosity about the world beyond his mountain refuge, and the possibility that healing might be a gift meant to be shared rather than hoarded in solitude. 3 days passed before the dog was strong enough to venture outside the cabin. Silas had taken to calling him Keeper, partly because the name felt right, and partly because the animal seemed determined to keep watch over everything: the cabin, the surrounding clearing, and most surprisingly, Silas himself. The morning Keeper first stood without favoring his injured side. Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of accomplishment that came from helping rather than simply surviving. It was a small victory, but it carried the weight of significance that reminded him of the satisfaction he'd once found in his carpentry work. When a perfectly joined corner or a smoothly sanded surface meant the difference between furniture that would last a season and pieces that could be passed down through generations. Keeper's recovery had brought changes to Silas's carefully ordered existence. Where once he'd moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, morning Bible reading, garden tending, evening carving, now he found himself adjusting his schedule around the dog's needs. Meals became shared affairs. Walks to the woodpile included a companion who insisted on investigating every scent and sound, and the long, silent evenings were filled with the comfortable presence of another living being. It was during one of these adjusted routines that Silas carved the wooden whistle. He'd been working on a pine figurine of a deer when Keeper had shown interest in the wood shavings, nosing them around the floor with obvious curiosity. Without conscious thought, Silas had selected a straight piece of birch and begun shaping it into something more interactive than decorative. The whistle was simple, a basic design Martha had taught him years ago when they'd volunteered at the church's summer camp for children. She'd shown him how to hollow out the chamber, how to cut the air passage just so, how to sand the mouthpiece smooth enough for small lips. The memory of her hands guiding his as he worked had been so vivid that for a moment Silas could almost smell the lilac water she'd worn. When he'd finished and blown a test note, Keeper's reaction had been immediate and extraordinary. The dog's ears had snapped to attention, his tail began wagging, and he'd moved to sit directly in front of Silas with the kind of focused attention that spoke of formal training. "Well now," Silas had murmured, That's interesting. He'd blown the whistle again, 2 short blasts followed by 1 long one, and Keeper had responded by lying down, then rolling over, then returning to the sitting position. It was a complex sequence that no ordinary pet would have known, and it confirmed what Silas had begun to suspect. Keeper was no ordinary dog. The realization that he was caring for what was obviously a working animal, possibly someone's beloved partner, created the first real internal conflict Silas had faced since retreating to the mountains. For 20 years, his moral universe had been simple: survive, remember Martha, and avoid causing harm to others through his presence in their lives. Now he found himself responsible for a creature that clearly belonged somewhere else, with people who were probably searching for him. But as the days passed and Keeper showed no inclination to leave, Silas began to rationalize keeping him. The dog was still healing after all, and those searchlights he'd seen that first night had never returned to this part of the mountain. Perhaps Keeper had wandered too far from wherever he'd started, and the searchers had given up or moved their efforts elsewhere. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Silas had forgotten how good it felt to be needed. It was Keeper who discovered the hunting trail that Silas had overlooked for 2 decades. The dog had been exploring the area behind the cabin when his behavior changed, becoming alert and purposeful in a way that drew Silas's attention. Following Keeper's lead, Silas found himself on a path he'd never noticed. Not a game trail, but something deliberately cut and maintained. Though clearly unused for years, the trail wound through dense pine groves and across small clearings, marked at intervals with notches cut into tree bark. Someone had taken considerable effort to create a reliable route through some of the most challenging terrain on Timber Ridge, and that someone had possessed both skill and local knowledge. As they followed the trail deeper into the forest, Silas found other signs of human presence: the remains of an old fire ring, a cache of rusted tools hidden beneath a cairn of stones, and most intriguingly, a series of wooden markers that bore carved symbols he didn't recognize. The discovery troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. For 20 years, he'd believed himself to be the only human presence on this part of the mountain, finding evidence of others, possibly others who'd used these trails recently enough that the markings remained clear, forced him to reconsider his understanding of his chosen isolation. It was while examining one of the carved markers that Silas heard the sound that would change everything. A child's voice, thin and frightened, calling for help. Keeper heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound with the instant alertness of a dog trained for search and rescue work. Before Silas could react, Keeper was moving down the trail with purpose, following the voice with the confidence of an animal who knew exactly what he was doing. Silas followed, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't been in the presence of another human being in 20 years, and the prospect of encountering a frightened child, awakened every protective instinct Martha had ever praised in him, while simultaneously triggering the fear that had kept him isolated for so long. They found young Tim Fletcher caught in a deadfall trap that had been set for larger game, but had snared the boy's leg instead. He was perhaps 10 years old, with sandy hair and wide blue eyes that showed more pain than panic. The boy had been trying to free himself for what looked like hours, and his efforts had only tightened the trap's grip. Silas remained hidden behind a large pine while Keeper approached the boy directly. The dog's demeanor was calm and reassuring, and Tim's face brightened immediately at the sight of a friendly animal. "Hey there, boy," Tim said, reaching out to stroke Keeper's head. "Where did you come from?" Keeper allowed the petting while positioning himself so that Tim could use him for support. It was a maneuver that spoke of extensive training, and Silas watched in amazement as the dog began what was clearly a practiced routine for calming and stabilizing an injured person. Working from concealment, Silas used his knowledge of trap mechanisms to spring the device that held Tim's leg. The boy cried out as the pressure released, but Keeper was there immediately, providing both physical and emotional support. "Good boy," Tim whispered, wrapping his arms around Keeper's neck. "You saved me," Silas ensured the boy could walk before melting back into the forest. Keeper following reluctantly after a long look at Tim, who was already hobbling back toward what Silas assumed was the main trail to town. Later, back at the cabin, Silas sat in his chair while Keeper lay on Martha's quilt, both of them processing what had happened. For the first time in 20 years, Silas had used his skills to help another human being. The act had been indirect and anonymous, but it had awakened something in him that felt suspiciously like purpose. The rescue of Tim Fletcher had stirred something in Silas that he'd thought buried along with Martha 20 years ago. For days afterward, he found himself replaying the moment when the boy's face had lit up at the sight of Keeper, the way the dog had instinctively known how to provide comfort and support. It had been a partnership, brief but perfect, and it reminded Silas of the countless times he and Martha had worked together to solve problems or help neighbors in need. Keeper seemed to sense the change in his human companion. The dog had become more attentive since the rescue, watching Silas with an intensity that suggested he was waiting for something, perhaps another opportunity to do the work he'd clearly been trained for, or maybe just confirmation that they were now a team rather than simply temporary roommates. It was while cleaning the cabin that Silas found Martha's quilting thimble. He'd been moving the old trunk that held her winter clothes, making room for a proper bed for Keeper when the small silver object had rolled across the floor. The thimble was tarnished with age, but still bore the delicate etching of roses that Martha had admired when her sister gave it to her as a wedding gift. Silas picked up the thimble with trembling fingers, and for the first time in 20 years, tears came. Not the angry, bitter tears he'd shed in the early days of his grief, but something softer, a recognition of love that persisted even in loss, of beauty that remained even when the hands that had created it were gone. Keeper moved to his side immediately, pressing his warm body against Silas's leg in a gesture of comfort that was both deeply canine and somehow more than that. The dog's presence anchored Silas in the present moment, preventing him from falling into the spiral of despair that had once threatened to consume him entirely. "She would have loved you," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Always wanted a dog, my Martha did. Said her house wasn't really a home without something alive in it besides the people." He settled into his chair with the thimble cradled in his palm, and Keeper lay down beside him, close enough that Silas could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since Martha's death, Silas began to talk about her not as a memory frozen in grief, but as a living part of who he'd been and who he might still become. He told Keeper about Martha's laugh, how it could fill a room and make even strangers smile, about her stubbornness when she believed she was right, which was most of the time, and how that same determination had helped her nurse sick animals back to health when others would have given up. He talked about their Sunday morning tradition of reading the newspaper together in bed, and how Martha would get indignant about injustices happening in places they'd never been to people they'd never meet. "She cared about everything," Silas said, stroking Keeper's head. "Sometimes I thought it would break her heart, caring so much about a world that could be so cruel. But it never did. Made her stronger somehow." The next morning brought the sound of voices again, closer this time. Silas peered through his window to see a search party moving methodically through the lower elevations of Timber Ridge. There were perhaps a dozen people, including several he recognized from his old life in Granger Hollow: Sheriff Coleman, Doc Henley, and what looked like most of the volunteer fire department. They were calling a name, not Tim's, but something that made Keeper's ears prick with immediate attention. Scout. They were calling for Scout. Silas looked down at the dog who had become his companion, his anchor to the world of the living, and felt his heart sink. Keeper Scout belonged to these people. He was their partner, their friend, possibly even their hope for finding others who might be lost in these mountains. Scout had heard his name being called and was already moving toward the door, his tail wagging with an excitement that spoke of recognition and longing. But when he reached the threshold, he stopped and looked back at Silas with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. "Go on, boy," Silas said quietly. "They're looking for you." But Scout didn't go. Instead, he returned to Silas's side and sat down, leaning his weight against the man's leg in a gesture that felt like a choice rather than confusion. The search party passed by without coming close to the cabin, their voices fading as they moved deeper into the forest. Scout watched them go with alert interest, but made no attempt to follow or signal his presence. When the last echo of their calls had died away, he looked up at Silas with eyes that seemed to say, "I'm where I choose to be." That evening, as Silas prepared their simple supper, he found himself wondering about the nature of choice and loyalty. Scout had clearly heard his name being called by people who cared about him, yet he'd chosen to stay. It was a decision that spoke of bonds formed not through training or duty, but through the kind of mutual need that creates family from strangers. The realization that Scout was choosing him, choosing this isolated life over whatever connection he'd had to the search party, was both humbling and terrifying. It meant that Silas was no longer simply surviving in solitude. He was responsible for the well-being of another creature who trusted him completely. As they sat before the fire that night, Scout resting his head on Silas's knee, while the man carved another small figure from pine, Silas began to understand that healing sometimes meant accepting the love that was offered, even when you didn't feel worthy of it. "We'll figure this out together," he told Scout, and felt the dog's tail thump against the floor in agreement. Outside, winter tightened its grip on Timber Ridge, but inside the cabin, two souls who had found each other in the storm were learning that sometimes the best response to being lost is not to find your way back to where you started, but to discover that where you are might be exactly where you belong. The next morning would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but for now, man and dog shared the quiet contentment of companions who understood that the most profound connections are often forged not in moments of joy, but in the patient tending of each other's wounds. The compass was small and brass, its face cracked but still functional, half buried in the snow near the old hunting trail where Silas and Scout took their morning walks. Scout found it first, his nose leading him directly to the spot where it lay hidden beneath a drift that had formed against a fallen log. Silas brushed the snow away carefully, revealing the initials TF, scratched into the metal casing with the rough precision of a child's handiwork. Tim Fletcher. The boy must have dropped it during his ordeal with the trap, and it had been covered by subsequent snowfall. "Well, Scout," Silas said, turning the compass over in his weathered hands. "Looks like young Tim lost more than just his way." The discovery created a dilemma that had been building in Silas's mind since the rescue. The boy's compass was clearly precious to him, a tool that spoke of careful instruction and trust placed in young hands. Leaving it buried in the snow until spring seemed cruel, but returning it would require Silas to venture closer to Granger Hollow than he'd been in 2 decades. Scout seemed to sense the significance of the find. He sat beside Silas with the alert attention that had become familiar, his brown eyes moving between the compass and his human companion, as if waiting for a decision. Over the following days, Silas found himself holding the compass during his evening reflections, remembering his own boyhood adventures with similar tools. His father had given him a compass for his 10th birthday, along with strict instructions about its care and use. "A man who knows where he's going and how to get back home is never truly lost," his father had said. The irony of finding himself thinking about home and direction after 20 years of deliberate isolation wasn't lost on him. The decision to approach Granger Hollow came gradually, built from small steps and careful reasoning. First, Silas justified a scouting trip to the tree line where he could observe the town from a distance. Then he reasoned that returning the compass was simply the right thing to do, what Martha would have expected of him. Finally, he admitted to himself that curiosity about the changes in his former home had been growing stronger with each passing day. Scout accompanied him on the journey down the mountain, moving with the quiet confidence of a dog accustomed to challenging terrain. As they descended, Silas noticed how the familiar landmarks of his youth had been altered by time and weather. The old Miller place had burned down, leaving only a stone chimney reaching toward the sky like a monument to forgotten lives. New houses dotted the valley floor, their modern lines and bright colors a stark contrast to the weathered buildings he remembered. From their concealed position among a stand of evergreens, Silas could see Main Street clearly for the first time in 20 years. Granger Hollow had grown, but it retained the essential character that had made it home. Children played in the small park near the church, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Adults moved with the unhurried pace of people who knew their neighbors and felt secure in their routines. Scout watched the scene with intense interest, his body language suggesting recognition rather than curiosity. Several times the dog's ears pricked at distant sounds, a car horn, children calling to each other, the bell above Murphy's Cafe, as if these were familiar elements of a world he'd known before his time on the mountain. It was then that Silas saw the cemetery. Martha's grave was visible from their vantage point, marked by the simple headstone he'd commissioned before his retreat to Timber Ridge. Even from a distance, he could see that someone had been tending it. Fresh flowers, winter pansies that could withstand the cold, adorned the site, and the area around the headstone was clear of weeds and debris. The sight hit him like a physical blow. For 20 years, he'd carried the guilt of abandoning Martha's resting place, of leaving her memory to the care of others while he nursed his grief in isolation. Seeing evidence that someone, probably several someones, had been honoring her memory in his absence brought a mixture of gratitude and shame that left him struggling for breath. Scout pressed against his leg, offering the solid comfort of his presence. The dog's calm acceptance of his emotional reaction reminded Silas that healing didn't always come in dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrived in small revelations, in the gradual understanding that love and care could continue even when the primary mourner had withdrawn from the world. As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from the general store and began walking toward the cemetery. Mrs. Whitman, her grey hair now white but her determined stride unchanged, carried a small bouquet of the same winter pansies that decorated Martha's grave. She moved with the purpose of someone performing a routine that had become as natural as breathing. Silas watched her approach Martha's headstone, replace the old flowers with fresh ones, and spend several minutes in what appeared to be silent conversation with the grave. When she finished, she placed her hand briefly on the headstone before turning to leave. The gesture was so simple, so matter-of-fact, that it took Silas several moments to understand its full significance. Mrs. Whitman wasn't visiting Martha's grave as a special occasion or obligation. This was regular maintenance, the kind of care that spoke of ongoing relationship rather than duty to the past. "She's been taking care of her," Silas whispered to Scout. "All these years, and she's been taking care of Martha." The realization that his wife's memory had been cherished and protected by the community he'd abandoned forced Silas to reconsider his understanding of his own exile. He'd convinced himself that his withdrawal had been noble, a way of protecting others from his pain while preserving the purity of his grief. But seeing evidence of Mrs. Whitman's faithful care made him wonder if his isolation had been less about protecting others and more about protecting himself from the risk of additional loss. Scout nudged his hand, drawing his attention back to the present moment. The dog's steady gaze seemed to ask a question that Silas wasn't quite ready to answer. If others had been caring for Martha's memory, what was stopping him from doing the same? As they made their way back up the mountain, the compass heavy in Silas's pocket, he found himself considering possibilities that had seemed unthinkable just hours before. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding from the world that had continued to honor the woman he'd loved. Perhaps Scout's presence in his life was meant to be a bridge back to the community he'd left behind, rather than simply a companion for his continued isolation. The questions would require careful consideration. But for the first time in 20 years, Silas felt ready to begin seeking answers. The collar was hidden beneath layers of Scout's thick winter coat, discovered only when Silas was checking the healing progress of the dog's wounds. His fingers found the worn leather band while parting the golden fur along Scout's neck, and he had to work carefully to reveal the full extent of what lay beneath. It was old leather, well-maintained, but showing the kind of wear that spoke of years of faithful service. The brass nameplate was tarnished but legible, and when Silas read the engraving, his world shifted in ways he wasn't prepared for. Scout was etched in simple block letters, followed by an address that made Silas's heart skip. Granger County Search and Rescue, Station 7, Two Rivers Township. Two Rivers was 30 miles east of Granger Hollow, a larger community that served as the county seat. If Scout belonged to their search and rescue unit, he was no ordinary working dog. He was a professional, trained for the kind of life and death missions that required absolute trust between human and canine partners. But it was what Silas found tucked into a small leather pouch attached to the collar that truly shook him. A folded piece of newspaper, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. It bore a headline that stopped his breath. Local woman dies in house fire despite rescue efforts. The article was brief, but devastating in its clinical recounting of that terrible night 20 years ago. It described the fire that had consumed the McCrae house on Elm Street, the response of local volunteer firefighters, and the arrival of the county's search and rescue team. Martha's death was noted with respectful brevity, along with the information that her husband had been treated for smoke inhalation, but survived. What caught Silas's attention, however, was a single line near the end of the article: County Search and Rescue Dog Scout. A 2-year-old golden retriever was among the responding units, but was unable to locate the victim in time due to the intensity of the blaze. Silas read the line 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Scout, this Scout, the dog who had collapsed at his door during the storm, had been there that night, had been part of the team that tried to save Martha, had carried his own burden of failure for the same tragedy that had driven Silas into the mountains. "Oh, boy," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Oh, my boy." Scout seemed to sense that something significant had been revealed. The dog moved closer, pressing his body against Silas's leg with the kind of deliberate comfort that spoke of understanding that went beyond normal canine intuition. His brown eyes held depths that Silas was only beginning to comprehend. Not just intelligence, but the weight of shared experience and mutual loss. The implications of the discovery cascaded through Silas's mind like stones down a mountainside. Scout hadn't wandered onto Timber Ridge by accident. He'd been drawn here by something deeper than coincidence, perhaps by the same forces that had brought him to the McCrae house 20 years ago, when he was young and eager and believed that every life could be saved if you just tried hard enough. Silas thought about the search party he'd observed, the voices calling Scout's name with the desperation of people who'd lost a valued partner. If Scout was a county search and rescue dog, his absence would be more than personal loss. It would represent a critical gap in their ability to save lives. Other people, other families, might be depending on capabilities that Scout alone could provide. But as Silas looked into Scout's eyes, he saw something that complicated the moral equation. This wasn't a dog who had wandered away and gotten lost. This was an animal who had made a choice, who had walked away from his previous life to seek out the one person who might understand the weight of carrying responsibility for lives that couldn't be saved. "You blame yourself too, don't you?" Silas said softly, running his fingers through Scout's fur. "All these years, and you've been carrying that night around just like I have." Scout's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement of understanding. In that moment, Silas realized that their relationship had been built on more than simple companionship. They were partners in grief, each carrying guilt for the same failure, each finding in the other a reflection of their own struggles with inadequacy and loss. The discovery explained Scout's behavior during the rescue of Tim Fletcher. The professional competence, the instinctive knowledge of how to provide comfort and support, the way he'd seemed to be waiting for another chance to do the work he'd been trained for. It also explained his choice to stay with Silas rather than return to his search and rescue team when they'd called his name. Scout had found something on Timber Ridge that he couldn't find with his official partners. Someone who understood that sometimes the best efforts aren't enough, and that the weight of that knowledge could drive even the most dedicated souls to seek refuge in isolation. As evening settled over the mountain, Silas sat in his chair with Scout at his feet and Martha's wedding ring in his hands. The three artifacts of his solitary life, the ring that represented love lost, Tim's compass that pointed toward community connection, and now Scout's collar that revealed their shared trauma, seemed to be creating a map toward something he couldn't quite envision yet. The moral complexity of keeping Scout had deepened considerably. This wasn't just about returning a lost pet to worried owners. Scout was a working dog with specialized skills that saved lives, and his absence from active duty represented real consequences for people who might need rescue in the future. But Scout's presence in Silas's life had also awakened something that had been dormant for 20 years, the understanding that healing could be a shared journey rather than a solitary ordeal. They had found in each other not just companionship, but recognition of the particular burden carried by those who blamed themselves for tragedies beyond their control. Outside, winter wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of more storms to come. Weather patterns suggested that the worst of the season was still ahead, and with it would come the likelihood of more people getting lost in the mountains, more families depending on search and rescue teams to bring their loved ones home safely. Silas looked down at Scout, who was looking back at him with eyes that seemed to hold questions rather than answers. The decision of what to do next would require more than moral reasoning. It would demand a fundamental choice about whether healing was meant to be hoarded in solitude or shared with a world that still needed the particular gifts that came from surviving loss and learning to live with the weight of caring. The newspaper clipping that would change everything was tucked deeper in Scout's collar than Silas had initially realized. When he'd examined the collar more thoroughly the next morning, his fingers had found a second, smaller pouch, this one containing a piece of newsprint that had been folded so carefully and preserved so meticulously that it seemed to pulse with significance. This article was different from the first, older, more detailed, and bearing a date that made Silas's hands tremble as he unfolded it. 3 days after Martha's death. The headline read, "Search Dog's Heroic Effort in Fatal House Fire Wins Community Praise." Silas read the article slowly, each word carving itself into his consciousness with the precision of a blade. It described Scout's actions on the night of the fire, how the young golden retriever had refused to give up his search even when the structure became too dangerous for human rescuers to remain inside. How he'd located Martha's position and led firefighters to her exact location. How his determined efforts had made her rescue possible, even though she ultimately succumbed to smoke inhalation at the hospital 3 days later. But it was the final paragraph that destroyed everything Silas thought he knew about that terrible night. According to Fire Chief Reynolds, the victim was still alive when Search Dog Scout located her in the smoke-filled bedroom. "That dog saved her life," Reynolds stated. "Without his work, we never would have found her in time. She lived for 3 more days because of what Scout accomplished in that house. That gave her husband time to say goodbye, time to make peace. Sometimes that's the best rescue you can hope for." The newspaper slipped from Silas's nerveless fingers. Scout had saved Martha. What failed to save her, saved her. Found her when human searchers couldn't, guided the firefighters to her location. Made possible the 3 days that Silas had spent holding her hand and listening to her voice and receiving her final words of love and forgiveness. 3 days that Silas had always seen as a cruel extension of suffering were revealed. To be the greatest gift Scout could have given. Time for goodbye. Time for Martha to tell him it wasn't his fault. Time for her to extract his promise to keep living even after she was gone. "You found her," Silas whispered, looking at Scout with eyes that were seeing him clearly for the first time. "You brought her back to me." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, and in that simple gesture, Silas heard an echo of the young dog who had risked everything to locate a woman trapped in a burning house, who had made possible the conversations and reconciliations that had ultimately allowed Silas to survive his grief. Even if he'd never understood their source, the revelation recontextualized everything. Scout's presence at the cabin wasn't coincidence or shared failure, it was completion. He'd found the one person who had benefited from his greatest professional success, the man whose life had been made bearable by Scout's courage and determination on the worst night either of them had ever experienced. Silas thought about the 3 days he'd spent at Martha's bedside, how she'd been lucid enough to share memories and express love, how she'd made him promise to find meaning in whatever life remained to him. He'd always wondered how she'd maintained such clarity and grace in her final hours, had attributed it to her natural strength and faith. Now he understood that her survival long enough to offer those gifts had been bought with the courage of a 2-year-old search dog who'd refused to abandon his mission even when the world was burning around him. "She knew," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Somehow she knew to thank you." He remembered now, Martha asking about the dog, wanting to know if the searchers' animals were safe, expressing concern for their well-being even as she struggled with her own injuries. At the time, he'd thought it was simply her natural compassion, extending even to working animals she'd never met. Now he understood it had been gratitude from someone who recognized that her final days had been purchased with extraordinary courage. The weight of 20 years of misplaced guilt began to shift, not disappearing but finding new context. Silas had blamed himself for not reaching Martha sooner, for not preventing the fire, for not being the one to save her. But Scout's actions had given him something more valuable than physical rescue, the opportunity to be present for Martha's transition from life to whatever came after. To serve as witness and companion during her final journey. Scout moved closer, pressing his warm body against Silas's leg with the kind of deliberate comfort that seemed to say, "I did my job that night, and now I'm here to help you do yours." "What is my job?" Silas asked aloud, the question emerging from some deep place he'd kept closed for 2 decades. Scout's response was to move toward the door, then look back with the expression Silas had learned to recognize as an invitation. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Scout led him not to their usual walking trail, but toward the path that descended toward Granger Hollow. As they walked, Silas found himself seeing the landscape with new eyes. The hunting trails he'd discovered weren't abandoned paths. They were routes that connected isolated areas to the main valley, exactly the kind of network that search and rescue teams would use to access remote locations where people might become lost or injured. His cabin wasn't a refuge from the world. It was a strategic position that offered overview of some of the most challenging terrain in the county. The skills he'd developed during 20 years of mountain living, combined with Scout's professional training and local knowledge, could serve purposes he'd never considered. The realization came gradually, built from small observations and growing understanding. Scout hadn't come to Timber Ridge to hide from his responsibilities. He'd come to find a partner who could help him fulfill them more effectively than ever before. The county search and rescue team had lost a valuable asset when Scout disappeared, but they might gain something even more valuable if he returned with a human partner who knew these mountains better than anyone alive. As they reached the tree line where Granger Hollow spread out below them, Silas felt the pull of possibility in a way he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. The town looked different now. Not like a place he'd fled from, but like a community that might have need of what he and Scout could offer together. "Is that what you've been trying to tell me?" Silas asked, looking down at Scout. "That it's time to stop hiding and start helping." Scout's tail wagged with unmistakable enthusiasm, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas began to seriously consider the possibility that his exile might be ending not in defeat, but in discovery of a purpose he'd never imagined. The newspaper clipping had revealed more than Scout's heroic past. It had illuminated a future where grief could be transformed into service, where the weight of caring could become a tool for helping others, and where the mountain that had served as refuge might become a base of operations for saving lives rather than simply preserving them. Standing at the edge of his old world and his new understanding, Silas felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become hope. Martha's locket had been waiting in the bottom drawer of the old dresser for 20 years, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. Silas found it while searching for clean clothes, the first time in decades he'd cared about his appearance. The small gold heart contained 2 photographs, one of Martha on their wedding day, radiant in her simple white dress, and one of the 2 of them together during their first Christmas as husband and wife. As Silas fastened the locket's delicate chain around his neck, the weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, a tangible connection to the man he'd been before grief had driven him into exile. His reflection in Martha's old hand mirror showed a stranger, weathered and grayed, but recognizably human in a way that surprised him. "What do you think, Scout?" he asked, turning to face the dog, who had been watching his preparations with alert interest. "Do I look like someone who might rejoin the world?" Scout's tail wagged approvingly, and he moved to stand beside Silas in a posture that spoke of partnership and support. Together, they would descend from Timber Ridge and enter Granger Hollow for the first time in 20 years, not as fugitives from life, but as potential contributors to the community Silas had abandoned. The decision to make this journey had crystallized over several days of careful consideration. Tim Fletcher's compass still needed to be returned, and Scout's revelation about Martha's rescue had created an obligation that transcended personal comfort. More than that, Silas had begun to understand that his years of isolation might have been preparation rather than punishment, a time of learning skills and gaining knowledge that could serve purposes beyond mere survival. The route down the mountain followed pathways that Scout seemed to know instinctively, trails that connected to the network of emergency access roads used by search and rescue teams. As they walked, Silas found himself seeing the terrain with tactical awareness, noting sightlines, water sources, shelter options, and the kind of hazards that could trap unwary hikers or hunters. 20 years of mountain living had taught him to read weather patterns, track animal movements, and navigate by landmarks that remained constant, while human constructions changed. These weren't skills he'd consciously developed for any purpose beyond staying alive, but now they revealed themselves as exactly the kind of knowledge that could make the difference between successful rescues and tragic failures. Scout's behavior during the descent confirmed what Silas had begun to suspect about their partnership. The dog moved, with the confidence of an animal returning to familiar work, checking back regularly to ensure Silas was keeping pace, pausing at decision points to allow consultation about route selection. It was the behavior of a working dog who had found his partner and was eager to return to service. As they approached the outskirts of Granger Hollow, Silas felt his chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The last time he'd walked these streets, he'd been a broken man, fleeing from reminders of everything he'd lost. Now he was returning as someone whose purpose remained unclear, but whose isolation had ended. The town showed signs of growth and prosperity that spoke well of the community's resilience. New houses dotted the hillsides, their modern designs somehow managing to complement rather than compete with the older structures that formed Granger Hollow's historic core. Children played in yards that showed the care of families who expected to remain in place for generations, and the general atmosphere suggested a place where people knew their neighbors and looked after each other's welfare. It was Doc Henley who spotted them first. The Old Physician was emerging from Murphy's Cafe when his gaze fell on the man and dog walking up Main Street. For a moment, his expression showed only mild curiosity, the automatic assessment of strangers that was second nature to someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for a small community's medical needs. Then recognition dawned, and his weathered face registered shock, concern, and something that might have been relief. "Silas McCrae," Doc Henley said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the crisp mountain air. "I'll be damned." The simple acknowledgement of his name, spoken without fear or accusation, hit Silas harder than he'd expected. For 20 years, he'd been nobody, a phantom who left no trace of his passage through the world. Hearing himself recognized and accepted felt like emerging from underwater after holding his breath for so long. He'd forgotten what air tasted like. "Doc," Silas replied, his own voice rusty but steady. "Good to see you." Other townspeople had begun to notice the unusual sight of a stranger walking down Main Street with a magnificent golden retriever at his side. But their reactions were more curious than alarmed, the kind of polite interest that small communities showed toward visitors who clearly belonged in their environment. Even if their presence was unexpected, it was Mrs. Whitman who made the connection between Silas and the flowers that had been appearing on Martha's grave. She emerged from the general store as word of his presence spread, studied his face with the sharp intelligence that had made her the unofficial keeper of Granger Hollow's collective memory, and nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "Those winter pansies don't plant themselves," she said simply, approaching with the kind of directness that had made her both feared and beloved for 3 generations. Though I wondered why someone was leaving them without taking credit. "You've been taking care of her," Silas said, his voice thick with gratitude. "All these years, we all have," Mrs. Whitman replied. "Martha was part of this community. Death doesn't change that." The conversation drew a small crowd, not the kind of gawking assembly that might form around an accident or argument, but the gentle gathering of people who recognized that something significant was happening and wanted to be present for it. Silas saw faces he remembered and others that were new, but all showed the kind of respectful attention that spoke of a community that valued both privacy and connection. Doc Henley stepped closer, his medical training evident in the way he assessed Silas's overall condition. "You look good," he said with professional satisfaction. "Mountain air agrees with you." "It's been a healing time," Silas replied, his hand moving unconsciously to touch Martha's locket through his shirt. "But I think it might be time for something different." Scout had remained calm throughout the interactions, but his alert posture suggested he was evaluating these humans with the same careful attention they were showing his partner. When young Tim Fletcher appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the unusual gathering, like any curious 10-year-old, Scout's tail began, wagging with unmistakable recognition. Tim approached with the kind of fearless curiosity that was characteristic of children who'd grown up in safe communities. His eyes lit up when he saw Scout, and he looked between the dog and Silas with dawning understanding. "You're the mountain angel," Tim said with the directness that only children could manage. "You saved me." The simple statement, delivered without drama or embellishment, carried the weight of absolute truth. Silas felt the attention of the assembled townspeople shift as they processed the implications of Tim's words. The mysterious helper who had freed the boy from the trap, the guardian presence that parents had half believed protected their children during mountain adventures. He was standing before them in the form of a grief-stricken neighbor who had never really left the community, only withdrawn to its margins. "Scout helped," Silas said, deflecting credit in the way that came naturally to someone who'd spent 20 years avoiding attention. "He's the one with the training." "Scout?" Doc Henley's eyebrows rose with interest. "County Search and Rescue has been looking for a dog named Scout, missing for weeks now." The moment had arrived, the choice between continued isolation and active engagement with the world that needed what he and Scout could offer together. Silas looked down at Scout, who was looking back at him with eyes that seemed to hold encouragement rather than pressure. The decision was his to make, but Scout's presence made it feel possible in a way that would have been unimaginable even days before. "That would be us," Silas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I think we might be ready to get back to work." The words hung in the crisp mountain air like a promise, and Silas felt the weight of 20 years of solitude beginning to transform into the anticipation of purpose renewed. The walk to Martha's grave felt like traveling through time itself. Scout moved beside Silas with quiet dignity, carrying in his jaws the bouquet of mountain wildflowers they had gathered together during their descent from Timber Ridge. The flowers were simple: Indian paintbrush, the lupine and wild columbine, but they represented something that had been impossible for 20 years, new life growing from old grief, beauty that persisted after loss. The cemetery lay just beyond the original boundaries of Granger Hollow, on a gentle hillside that offered views of the valley where Martha had spent her entire life. As they approached her grave, Silas felt his steps slow, not from reluctance, but from the magnitude of the moment. This would be the first time he'd stood it. Martha's resting place since the day they'd lowered her casket into the frozen ground. The headstone was exactly as he remembered it, simple granite bearing her name, dates, and the inscription he'd chosen in those first raw days of grief. Beloved wife, teacher, friend. But the area around it showed evidence of decades of faithful care. The grass was neatly trimmed, weeds had been cleared away, and the winter pansies Mrs. Whitman had mentioned created a border of cheerful color against the stark landscape. Scout placed the wildflower bouquet gently beside the existing flowers, his movements careful and deliberate. Then he settled into a sitting position beside the grave, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something only he could hear. Silas knelt on the cold ground, his weathered hands trembling as they touched the granite for the first time in 20 years. The stone was solid and real, warmed slightly by the winter sun, and it anchored him to the present moment in a way that felt both grounding and liberating. "Hello, Martha," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." The words came slowly at first, then with increasing ease as 20 years of solitary conversations found their proper audience. He told her about the cabin, about the garden where he'd grown her favorite flowers, about the wooden figures he'd carved while thinking of their life together. He described Scout's arrival and the gradual understanding that healing could be a shared journey rather than a solitary ordeal. "He saved you, Martha," Silas said, his voice growing stronger. "Scout here, he's the one who found you that night, who made it possible for us to have those 3 days. I never knew. All these years, I never understood that those final conversations, those moments of peace, they were his gift to us." Scout's ears pricked at his name, but the dog remained motionless beside the grave, as if understanding that this was a conversation that required his presence but not his participation. As Silas spoke, he became aware of other people gathering at a respectful distance. Word of his presence had spread through Granger Hollow with the efficiency that characterized small communities, and townspeople were arriving in ones and twos to witness what many had begun to understand was a significant moment in their collective story. Mrs. Whitman stood with her daughter Sarah, both women's faces showing the kind of emotional engagement that spoke of personal investment in Silas's well-being. Doc Henley had brought his medical bag, a reflexive gesture that suggested he was prepared to provide whatever support might be needed. Sheriff Coleman maintained a protective perimeter, ensuring that curiosity didn't intrude on what was clearly a private moment of reconciliation. Most moving of all was the presence of Tim Fletcher and his parents, the boy standing quietly beside his father while understanding instinctively that the man who had saved him was engaged in something that required reverence rather than thanks. People here have been taking care of you," Silas continued, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Mrs. Whitman and others, They've been keeping your memory alive while I was hiding from it. They understood something I couldn't, that love doesn't end with death. And that community means caring for each other, even when some members can't care for themselves. The assembled townspeople heard these words, and several dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. What Silas intended as private conversation with his deceased wife had become inadvertent testimony to the power of sustained compassion and the ways that communities could hold space for grief while continuing to nurture hope. Scout rose from his sitting position and moved closer to Silas, pressing his warm body against the man's side in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. The contact was grounding, a reminder that the past could be honored without being imprisoned by it, that love could persist without requiring the lover to sacrifice present possibilities to memory. "I think it's time for me to stop hiding," Silas said, his hand finding Scout's head and stroking the soft fur. "This boy has shown me that healing happens through service, not solitude. That the best way to honor what we had is to use what I learned from losing you to help others who might be facing their own kinds of loss." The words carried a finality that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As Silas rose from his knees, brushing dirt from his clothes, he felt the weight of 20 years of guilt beginning to transform into something that might eventually become wisdom. The wooden bench took shape beneath Silas's hands with the same careful attention he'd once brought to Martha's hope chest and their kitchen table. He worked with tools borrowed from the town's maintenance shed, crafting something simple but enduring from mountain pine that would weather decades of seasons beside Martha's grave. The bench represented more than a place to sit. It was a commitment to regular visits, a promise that Martha's memory would be tended not just by the generous hearts of neighbors, but by the husband who had finally learned that honoring the past meant engaging with the present. As Silas worked, townspeople found reasons to pass by the cemetery. Some brought coffee or sandwiches, others simply offered quiet words of encouragement. Tim Fletcher arrived with his compass, returned at last to its proper owner, along with a shy confession that he'd been hoping to meet the mountain angel who had saved his life. "Keep that compass close," Silas told the boy, accepting the awkward hug that Tim offered. "A man who knows where he's going and how to get back home is never truly lost." Scout supervised the bench construction with the alertness of a project manager, occasionally investigating Silas's work, but mostly maintaining watch over their surroundings. His behavior had shifted since their arrival in town, less protective, more collaborative, as if he understood that they were no longer hiding but building something together. Doc Henley approached as Silas was applying the final coat of weather sealant to the bench's surface. The elderly physician carried himself with the careful dignity of someone whose joints protested. Cold weather, but whose sense of duty remained undiminished. "County Search and Rescue. Coordinator called this morning," Doc said without preamble. "Seems they've been missing their best dog for quite some time." Silas looked up from his work, noting the careful neutrality in Doc's voice. "What did you tell them?" "That Scout might have found himself a new partner," Doc replied. "Someone with local knowledge that could make their operation more effective than it's ever been." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of men who understood that important decisions required thoughtful consideration. Doc explained that the county's search and rescue program had been struggling with personnel shortages and budget constraints. Volunteers were aging out of active service, and recruitment had been challenging in an era when younger people often left rural areas for opportunities in larger communities. "What they need," Doc said, settling onto the new bench to test its stability, "is someone who knows these mountains better than anyone alive, paired with a dog who's proven he can find people when it matters most." Sheriff Coleman joined them as the conversation continued, bringing practical knowledge about the kinds of emergencies that required search and rescue response in their part of the county. Lost hikers were the most common calls, but there were also hunters who overestimated their abilities, elderly residents who wandered away from care facilities, and occasionally children who ventured too far from safe boundaries. Average response time from the county seat is 45 minutes, Sheriff Coleman explained. By the time they arrive, organize, and begin searching, critical hours have passed. Someone based locally, someone who could begin search operations immediately. That could be the difference between rescue and recovery. The offer they outlined was both simple and profound. Silas would receive basic certification as a search and rescue volunteer, building on skills he'd developed through 20 years of mountain living. Scout would be officially partnered with him rather than returned to the county kennels. Together, they would serve as the region's first response team for wilderness emergencies, supported by county resources but operating with the independence that came from intimate knowledge of local terrain. "There's a small salary," Doc added. "Nothing that'll make you rich, but enough to cover expenses and maintain your equipment." "Equipment?" Silas asked. Sheriff Coleman grinned. "Radio communications, medical supplies, specialized gear for mountain rescues. The county's been wanting to establish a remote station in this area for years. Your cabin would be perfect for the purpose." The vision they painted was compelling. Silas's refuge transformed into a base of operations. His solitary skills repurposed for community service. His partnership with Scout formalized into something that could save lives on a regular basis. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work that Martha had always believed could heal the world one person at a time. As the sun began to set over Granger Hollow, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Silas found himself looking at his wife's grave with new understanding. The bench he'd built would serve future visitors, but it would also mark the place where his real life had resumed after 20 years of mere survival. Scout moved to sit beside the bench, his posture alert but relaxed, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment, when purpose and partnership finally aligned with opportunity. "What do you think, boy?" Silas asked, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Scout's fur. "Ready to get back to saving lives?" Scout's tail wagged with unmistakable enthusiasm, and in that simple gesture, Silas heard the echo of Martha's voice saying what she'd always said when faced with the opportunity to help. "When someone needs you, you show up." It was time to show up. 6 months later, the wooden sign that marked the entrance to Silas's cabin bore fresh paint and clear lettering. "McCrae and Scout Mountain Rescue." The simple declaration represented more than a change in profession. It announced the transformation of a place of hiding into a center of hope for anyone who might find themselves lost in the unforgiving wilderness of Timber Ridge. The cabin itself had expanded to accommodate its new purpose. A radio antenna extended above the roofline, connecting Silas and Scout to the county's emergency communication network. A storage shed housed specialized equipment, ropes and climbing gear, emergency medical supplies, portable shelters, and the kind of high-tech search tools that made 21st century rescue operations possible even in terrain that hadn't changed since the mountains first rose from ancient seas, but the heart of the operation remained unchanged. A man and his dog, partners in the truest sense, who understood that saving lives was less about equipment than about the willingness to venture into dangerous places when others needed help. Their first official rescue had come just 3 weeks after Silas received his certification. An elderly birdwatcher named Harold Kozlov had become disoriented during a photography expedition, wandering off marked trails in pursuit of what he'd thought was a rare warbler. By the time his wife reported him missing, Harold had been lost for 8 hours in terrain that could kill an unprepared person in a matter of hours. Silas and Scout had found him within 90 minutes, hypothermic but alive, sheltering beneath a rocky overhang less than 2 miles from where he'd left his car. The rescue had been textbook, Scout's nose leading them directly to the missing man, Silas's knowledge of the terrain allowing them to approach from the most accessible direction, their combined experience ensuring that Harold received appropriate care during the evacuation process. The success had established their reputation and led to regular calls for assistance. They'd located lost hikers, found missing children, and assisted with medical evacuations in areas too remote for traditional ambulance service. Each rescue reinforced what Silas had learned during those first days with Scout. Healing happened through service, and the best response to personal loss was often to prevent others from experiencing similar tragedy. The regular trips to town had become part of Silas's routine, as natural as his morning walks with Scout or his evening reflections beside Martha's grave. Mrs. Whitman's general store served as an informal headquarters where people could leave messages about potential emergencies or simply check on the welfare of the mountain rescue team. Doc Henley provided medical consultation and helped maintain the first aid supplies that might mean the difference between successful rescue and tragic outcome. Sheriff Coleman had become both colleague and friend, sharing information about missing person cases and coordinating with county authorities when situations required resources beyond what Silas and Scout could provide alone. The law enforcement network had embraced them as valuable assets, recognizing that their local knowledge and immediate availability filled crucial gaps in emergency response capabilities. Tim Fletcher, now a confident 11-year-old, had appointed himself as Scout's unofficial junior partner. The boy visited the cabin regularly, learning basic search techniques and developing the kind of wilderness skills that would serve him well throughout his life. His parents had initially worried about their son's fascination with search and rescue work, but they'd come to understand that Tim was learning valuable lessons about responsibility, courage, and service to others. The relationship between Silas and the community had evolved beyond simple acceptance into genuine partnership. He'd built furniture for the new families moving into Granger Hollow, applying his carpentry skills to create pieces that would last for generations. His knowledge of local weather patterns and seasonal changes had made him a valuable resource for anyone planning outdoor activities. And his gentle manner with children had led to requests for him to speak at the school about wilderness safety. But it was Scout who had truly captured the community's heart. The dog attended town events with the dignity of a canine ambassador, allowing children to pet him while maintaining the alertness that characterized professional working animals. His presence at community gatherings served as a reminder that help was always available for those who might find themselves in trouble, and that courage could take many forms. The evening routine at the cabin had settled into patterns that honored both past and present. Silas still read aloud from Martha's Bible, but now he included Scout in the ritual, speaking directly to the dog about the day's activities and the calls they might receive tomorrow. The carved figures that filled the cabin's shelves had evolved to include depictions of the people they'd rescued, a growing gallery of lives that had been preserved through their partnership. As winter approached once again, the anniversary of Scout's arrival during that first terrible storm, Silas found himself standing at his window, watching snow begin to fall with the same intensity that had driven a wounded dog to seek shelter exactly 1 year earlier. Scout sat beside him, no longer the injured creature who had collapsed at his door, but a confident, healthy animal whose presence had transformed isolation into purpose. The sound that interrupted their vigil was familiar. The emergency radio crackling to life with a call about missing hikers somewhere on the eastern slopes of Timber Ridge. Silas reached for his gear while Scout moved toward the door, both of them responding with the practiced efficiency of partners who understood their work and trusted each other completely. "Ready, boy?" Silas asked, shouldering his pack and checking the radio one final time. Scout's tail wagged once, and in that simple gesture, Silas heard echoes of everything that had brought them to this moment. Martha's love, the community's faith, the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience and courage. Outside, the storm was building, but Silas McCrae and Scout were no longer hiding from the weather. They were heading directly into it, carrying hope to someone who needed rescue. proving once again that the most profound transformations often begin with a single act of opening the door when something wounded arrives seeking shelter. The legend of the fearsome mountain man had become a story of redemption and second chances, and tonight, somewhere in the storm, that story would continue.